So, welcome to Night Hacking at the QCon New York conference. My name's Stephen Chin. I'm the Java Community Manager, and I'm joined by Peter Lawrey. How are you doing, Peter?
Yeah, not too bad. It's been good conference so far.
Yeah, no, this has been pretty nice. QCon always does a good job with getting solid technical content
Yes.
at their events.
Yep.
And speaking of solid technical content, you were doing one of the many microservice talks here.
Yes. So the focus for my talk was to provide a different perspective from the direction of fintech or financial technology, and in particular, what can microservices and trading systems learn from each other. Um, and the main takeaways there was that microservices can offer some standard tools, some standard terminology, and some good methodologies for getting yourself up and running quickly. One of the things that is often done in trading systems is that they're often custom made and ad hoc. Sometimes that's a good thing, but sometimes that's not necessarily adding any value. You may as well stick with what is already available.
Yeah, so my guess is a primary concern for trading systems is going to be high performance, like low latency, high performance.
Yeah, that is the primary concern, but that's usually the core part, the critical path that you need to worry about. The core part of your system
Got it.
needs to be fast, but the reality is that there's a lot of tools and functionality that goes around this, such as monitoring, deployment issues. Your deployment doesn't need to be so fast. Your monitoring only needs to be so fast. Your management tools, build tools, all of these things are common across software packages, and they don't really need to be customized. It's only small sections of your code which need to be tuned to death, and that might be as small as 10 to 20% of your entire code base. So
Okay,
yeah,
so if you can use open frameworks for the rest of the stuff, which
exactly.
is non-critical path, and actually take advantage of some stuff being built for microservices, which might also apply, then
Exactly.
you can gain a lot of efficiencies.
Yeah, so another thing that I've come across again and again talking to clients in banks is that there's sort of this feeling that, oh, we're at a bank, we can't have nice things. But in reality, a lot of microservices is a bringing together of best practices from that have been around for some time,
Yeah.
and in fact, they will actually be using a good percentage of those techniques. Sometimes it's as low as 40%, but it's a decent percentage. And by rebranding what they have already, or at least taking a different view on what they have already, then they can see that they are doing a lot of these best practices already, and in particular, they can see where the quick wins are. So with very minimal effort, they can benefit, maybe take that 40% to 50 or 60%. It's still not perfect, but that often that 10 or 20% improvement doesn't come with much effort.
Yeah.
And so there's an opportunity there to get improvement with low risk. On the flip side, trading systems have been building distributed systems that are highly performant with asynchronous messaging for a long time. They tend to be independently deployable, although that's not always a priority. But certainly the ability for event-driven asynchronous messaging is a fairly standard practice and a well understood concept. And where this is significant is when it comes to debugging and testing these kind of systems, which is
Yeah.
something of a challenge for a lot of microservices. How do you test and debug? How do you deploy these? How do you even understand how to model an asynchronous service as opposed to a synchronous one where you used to request response, things like REST APIs? And these problems are solvable. They have been solved, and I think it's you shouldn't sort of reject microservices on the basis that, well, these are issues and they're not always handled very well, because they can be. You just need to learn how to do that.
Okay, so possibly something microservice frameworks can learn from financial trading
Yeah, but a lot of
applications.
this is about methodologies.
Yeah.
I'm very keen on methodologies rather than necessarily you install a piece of software and all your problems are solved.
Yeah.
You do need to understand what it is you're doing, and by using a methodology, you can that's all you need, because then you don't have to change your products necessarily. You just use them in a different way.
Okay, that makes sense. Um, so you also had a second topic you were thinking would be fun to chat about.
Yeah, so I'm a topic that I'm working on at the moment is exception handling, and I know it's not a very exciting topic, but it's one that's often undervalued or underlooked, because developers spend so much time trying to get their happy path to work. They don't actually have time or the bandwidth to concentrate on, well, what happens when things go wrong. And so often the answer is...
Usually the answer is it doesn't go right.
Yeah, well, usually the answer is I don't know what to do, so I'll just log it, and it'll effectively become a DevOps problem. I just kick it over the fence, and they can worry about it. The truth is that this is often the case. Often the case is you don't know what to do with these exceptions, but the reality is that that doesn't have to be the case. There are many situations where you can do something about it, and you should probably spend a bit of time thinking, well, what are the alternatives to just logging it? How can what other things can I do?
What would be an example of a situation where perhaps you could log it, but there's something better you could do?
Well, a very simple one is if you have a thread that's been interrupted. So you do a thread.sleep. One common pattern is to reset the interrupt flag on the thread. So instead of sleeping, you bail out of whatever it is you're waiting on, but you continue, but you leave the thread in an interrupted state. It's very common for people to consume interrupts and then effectively making it that it's a bit random. It's like a random shot if you interrupt a thread, and then it becomes not a very useful functionality. Whereas if you preserve interrupts, that will cause the thread to run through, but without any pausing and sleeping, and keep that state. And it actually has a chance of shutting down the thread cleanly. That one's it's not very often that this is the case, but it's a very simple solution.
Yeah, and probably in most systems, it's completely unreliable to use thread interrupts just because of the way they handle it.
That's very unfortunately the case, is that a lot of third-party libraries, you don't know what they're going to do if you were to interrupt them, or if they will do anything at all. So that's a bit of a challenge in using it. But if you want to know how to make a good interrupts, handle them properly, then in this case for interrupt exceptions, you can reset the flag and continue on. The best strategy is if you can find some sort of fallback mechanism, where after a particular exception occurs, you take an action to try and correct for whatever it is that failed. So a common one is if you're doing, say, socket handling, if you fail to read from a socket, you'll close the connection, you try again, you reconnect after some suitable time out period, and then attempt to continue on. So there's often, certainly did a review of our code base, and then it certainly was not perfect, and we made a lot of changes, but we ended up having nearly 20% of all exceptions being handled by a fallback position. So they're not just consumed, they're actually being handled automatically by the code. But it was only 20%. Somewhere close to
the other 80% are... Oh, you were going to...
Yeah, actually close to the 50% were actually either logging, recording, or just consuming, somewhat close to discarding, but not necessarily.
Yeah.
And the way we dealt with that is, rather than logging it, we call a callback an exception handler. The idea of the exception handler is that you may just want to log it in production, but in unit tests, we can see every exception that's actually run that occurred while that test was running, and we can make sure.
Good. You can actually check to make sure you're testing for the exception cases.
Yes, because often these exceptions might be thrown in another thread.
Yeah.
So they won't necessarily, even if it blows up that thread, that test may actually pass. But the reality is that you should never have got that exception in any thread, because that won't necessarily get passed back to the current thread. Another thing that we actually do is when certain exceptions occur and you're running in debug mode, it actually will pop up a Stack Overflow page for that exception. So it captures the version of Java you're running, the exception, its message, and then opens an appropriate page in Stack Overflow.
You go straight from the exception to Peter Lawrey's comments about how to fix the issue.
Yes, something like that. Yeah. So it's something that we do anyway. So it just saves you a bit of time. It's surprising the first couple of times it happens, but it's a bit of a time saver. Because so many people, when they get exceptions, they just don't know how to make sense of them. And by bringing up a page that attempts to decode it for you, it can be quite helpful.
Well, if they're good, they probably are pasting it in Google and searching for it.
Exactly.
Anyway.
So
So
we
you're
have
just
two
automating
exception
that
handlers, one for Stack Overflow, one for Google.
Nice. So did you find that try with resources was helpful when you were doing the exception refactoring of your code base?
We use try with resources in quite a few places, but not so much the exception refactoring. Probably the main one that we had was we added lambdas that can throw exceptions.
Oh, okay.
So we had code that's sitting inside a lambda, but it may throw a checked exception. And these two are not don't work very well together, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So, but what you can do is we have a throwing supplier, throwing consumer, throwing runnable, and these can throw a checked exception. And that way, the code that's been called by the lambda can throw a checked exception and then have it consumed by the caller, and it comes through transparently.
Yeah, so that's the other question I was going to ask you, is whether you get an opinion about checked versus unchecked exceptions. So.
Well, a lot of people don't like checked exceptions, and I think that's because they don't know what to do with them anyway.
Yeah.
And that's just annoying them. So we sort of take a little bit of a bet both ways. I think checked exceptions are very useful for developing libraries. And to give you an example, I took one of our unchecked exceptions, which was a runtime exception, and I temporarily changed it to be a checked one. And what I found was that there were all sorts of places that had been documented as throwing this exception, which didn't. And vice versa. There was a lot of places where it was actually being thrown, but not being documented.
Yeah.
And there was no way to trace that through, no practical way of tracing that through without the compiler helping you through that process. And I took some satisfaction in a number of cases where it said, catch this runtime exception, rethrow it with an assertion error saying, this should never happen. And in reality, the compiler could tell me, this never actually does happen. So I was able to eliminate those sections of code. So I think it's very useful. When I did that review for this one exception, I ended up fixing 6 bugs and changing 65 files. And that wouldn't have not
it back to a runtime after
exactly,
you did the
because actually the reality is that I don't necessarily want callers of this code to have to worry about handling it, because there's a good chance they won't know what to do with it anyway. But for developing the library internally, it was very useful. And in fact, I actually have a hacked version of some common built-in runtime exceptions to do exactly the same exercise. Because I use a legal state exception, a legal argument exception. I even try, not as useful, but I do it also for null pointer exception as well.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
And then the documentation will actually match the unchecked exceptions that you can actually get.
All right, well, thanks very much for the interview.
Oh, pleasure.
Peter, and thanks everyone for joining us for the Night Hacking lunch session here at QCon New York. You can watch all the live recordings at nighthacking.com, and I will see you guys at a future event such as JCrete.
Very good.
All right, thank you.